what I thought was most interesting and what drew me to this work so much is that working in NLP as long as we have now, people's internal representations are always available. And I have gotten into the habit as a practitioner to just stop whenever I feel like there's a lot of energy around something. So whether it's a place in this person's life, whether it's a person, whether it's a concept, as soon as I stop, and this is outside of metaphors for movement now, this is just in my own practice as a practitioner, is that if I stop and ask the internal representation, so my example is, if I feel as though I don't want to do something, so some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but if I say to, Al and I are driving home on a Sunday, and Al says, hey, do you want to stop? We have a few hours of work to do. Do you want to stop and do it at the office, or do you want to do it at home? And I immediately, in this case, answered, well, I want to do it at home. And yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. I have heard of it. I'm interested. Anyway, so my response is, yeah, I want to go work at home, which doesn't actually work very well, right? Because our files and everything are at the office. It'll be more efficient. It's actually going to go better if we do it at the office. But if that went unchecked, I would have just said, let's go home. But when I stop for a second and say, okay, why was I just drawn that way? And in this example, it doesn't matter a whole lot one way or the other. But if I check that IR, so in that example, if I say, okay, well, what is my internal representation right now of the office? So when I say the word office, just like every single thing in our entire lives, there is a picture in my mind with associated meaning, beliefs, ideas, and everything else, an internal representation in my mind of the office. And if I don't pay attention to that, it's going to have an impact and an influence on how I think and how I feel and how I make decisions and everything else. And so in that one, what I checked out was, okay, what's my internal representation? And when I checked out the internal representation, I realized one of the qualities of the internal representation of the office is that it's cold. And I didn't want to be cold. So it was this really interesting thing where, like, wait a minute, I actually own this office. I can just turn up the heat, right? Like, it doesn't have to be cold. I can go turn the heat up. And then we'll be able to stop at the office, and it will just be more efficient, and it will take less time, and we can get back to our family on a Sunday. But if I didn't let that go unchecked, right? If I did let that go unchecked, the number of times that we're drawn into decisions, not realizing that our internal representations are contributing to decisions that aren't necessarily in our best interest or getting us where we want to go. And that's a mild little micro example, but think about how you have an internal representation of the people that you love, the people that you don't love, the things that are most important to you. And if you slow those down and start looking at internal representations, you may be very, very surprised at how much more control, right? So in my head, I just recognize that, like, right, okay, I can actually turn the heat up, change that internal representation. And my decisions now can be based on what is actually going to be more effective and efficient, as opposed to just the feeling that I was getting cold. Nobody, I don't know, maybe you guys like to be cold, but I just don't like to be cold more so than other things, right? So that was that work. Yeah, I'll stop talking. But that was what really drew me into this work, is realizing that so often, rather than getting complicated in all of the tools and the techniques, if I just stop and say to a client, you know what, you've said that word, or that you've referenced this thing a number of times, and there seems to be a lot of energy around it or not. What do you see in your head right now when you say that word? Get the internal representation and just use it as data. Notice what you notice about it and know that it's changeable.
And when people talk about their internal, when we sense something and they have an internal representation, remember that they've eliminated most of the information about their world when they allowed the internal representation to come in and to give it meaning, right? We're deleting the preponderance of information around us. Our delete filters are reducing the fire hose down to somewhere around 134 bits per second. And then we're making decisions. So Tara's decision that the office wasn't a pleasant place to work was based on a limited amount of information. When she opened up, when she actually examined it, and it challenged her IRs, which were based on a temperature, it shifted everything. And that's the same with clients. So what you will find is that when you listen to Tara or I work, we'll do things like SMDs seamlessly in the moment. And we'll do them before a technique, after a technique, in the middle of the technique. Doesn't matter. They don't alter the flow of anything. If we find something of importance, and as Tara said, it's just data or data, we get the SMDs and we park them because we might use that later. It also is a great tool when you have a client who finds difficulty doing one of the tasks you do, and you get the IRs for that, and then get the IRs for a task that they find easy to do, and you just map them across. It's super effective in knocking down resistance. And so the IRs that we have, I think we have, I like to go back, I'm suggesting what I do and what Tara, I know Tara does, is go back and we remind ourselves that those internal representations that combine with our physiology to create our state are based on a minuscule amount of data. And the data that gets in, those three filters, delete, distort, and generalize, are fluid based on our emotional state. I would say that the fallacy in the model, in the communication model, is when IR connects to physiology to create your emotional state, it impacts the filters. So the external world, when you're triggered and you get angry, your delete filter goes up and it only lets information through that corroborates with you being angry. And now the internal representation. So I think the fallacy is that it's in and out, and I don't think so. I think there's a circular path that goes in, and affects your filters, and then that lets in. And that's where we lead to the concept of the pattern interrupt. We interrupt the emotional pattern. When we interrupt the emotional pattern, we impact the filters. When we impact the filters, now we experience our world as different. We start to hear and see and feel differently. So some of the most subtle, some of the most simple techniques of NLP, that's why they have some of the massive impact they have. Because when you do a pattern interrupt, when you do a squirrel, right? You're changing the filters. When you're changing the filters, then you change what gets into your IR and what combines with your physiology to create your emotional state. And so, if you think of this abstract to detail, metaphors are up at the abstract. We're telling a story that's not absolutely representative. You know, when you ask somebody, how are you doing today? And they say, I feel like I can fly, as their metaphor for their opportunity that day, that is very abstract about where they are in their life, right? You have to agree that's a very abstract metaphor. But if we ask them, so as you think about flying, can you get a picture? And we get the submodalities. We're down here in the detail. We've chunked way down. And VAK, the standard visual auditory kinesthetic, is sort of a mid-level chunk. So if you say, are you seeing the image, hearing the image, or feeling this? So I feel like I can fly. Okay, well, that's a mid-level chunk. The metaphor I can fly is a massively abstract chunk if you ask for the submodalities. And the beauty is, I think, and I think the gift or the skill to work on as an NLP practitioner or coach is to be able to move fluidly from detail to abstract, and from abstract back into detail, to not only match the client, but also to pace and lead the client. Because if a client's stuck in detail or stuck in their metaphor, you might be able to move them at that level. You might have to go down in chunk size like Virginia Satir would have done, or down into the detail. Or if they're stuck in the detail, you might have to move them up and use metaphors as Milton Erickson did. But it's all based on this IR and the impact the IR is having when it connects to our physiology. And I think, you know, we teach NLP in a fairly linear way, especially at Crack. You know, we have these little building blocks that start, and the first 2 days are building blocks. And then all of a sudden we start launching into techniques. And again, I use the excuse of time, but we don't really have time to connect all the theory in the structure to the technique so that the practitioner actually knows what they're doing, right? Or why what they're doing works so well, right? So when you start to understand what's happening in this dynamic, that actually allows you to be more fluid.